Welcome and hello. I'm Rachel Bustamante, Campaign Coordinator at Plastic Pollution Coalition. Thank you for joining our September webinar, Policy Matters, Finalizing the UN Plastics Treaty. Plastic Pollution Coalition is a nonprofit communications and advocacy organization that collaborates with an expansive global alliance of organizations, businesses, and individuals to create a more just, equitable, and regenerative world, free of plastic pollution and its toxic impacts. All right, everyone, we have 4 quick poll questions to get to know you a little bit better. Each one will pop up for just about 20 seconds, so jump in and answer fast. Poll 1, where are you joining us from today? Select one. Looks like we have a lot of representation from North America. We have some folks joining from Central and South America, Europe and North Asia, and Australia. We're so grateful that you're here and joining us today. On to our next poll. Have you been following the UN Plastic Treaty negotiations? Select one. All right, so looks like we have about the majority somewhat following, a little bit less following closely, and a lot here to learn. We're all going to learn together and we're going to dive into it. So we're glad you're here with us. And our third question, what issues do you believe require the most attention during the final negotiations of the UN Plastics Treaty? And actually, this one's multiple choice, so feel free to select all the issues you think are big issues for the final negotiations. Okay, looks like the majority see reducing plastic production as a big key concern. We have addressing toxic chemicals in plastics and rejecting false solutions as also key concerns as well. All of these really are big issues, so we're definitely going to talk about these topics today and dive into it. And our last question, what do you think are the biggest risks to a strong and ambitious treaty during the final negotiations of the UN Plastics Treaty? All right, definitely looks like a big concern is around industry influence, some concern around agreeing on a weak treaty now with intent to strengthen later, and political compromises. These are definitely all potential risks. And we're going to dive into a lot of these topics today. So thank you for participating in the poll questions. So today we are going to hear from Frankie Arona, Shiv Srivastava, and Richard Thompson in conversation with Julie Teal-Simmons. So it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Julie Teal-Simmons. Julie is a senior attorney with the Center for Biological Diversity's Ocean Program. She works to protect people, marine biodiversity, and ecosystems from a wide range of threats, including plastic and petrochemical pollution, vessel traffic and noise, fishing gear entanglements, oil and gas development, and climate change. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and just a big thank you to the whole Plastic Pollution Coalition team. You put on such a stellar webinar series, and I'm so happy to be here today with an amazing panel to talk about this huge issue of the Global Plastics Treaty and the role it has to play in our collective fight to reduce plastic pollution across the plastics life cycle, or death cycle, as we like to call it, in the Break Free from Plastic movement. I think many of you know, but it was interesting to see that some of you are just new to this topic. But as many of you know, in March 2022, the UN Environment Assembly, or UNEA, adopted an absolutely historic resolution to develop a legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution. That was its stated goal. And the UN and its member countries have, for the most part, really recognized that plastics pose a triple threat to climate, public health, and global biodiversity. And so this was a really groundbreaking announcement, and a lot of us were ready to roll up our sleeves and get into it. So now we've had a few years working on the treaty, and I have one slide only because I want to get right to our amazing panelists to talk about their engagement in this process. But in the last 2 years, they've been making progress on negotiating this treaty text, and they were given a very quick timeline as far as international agreements go. They only got till the end of this year to finalize the treaty text. That is their mandate. And so there have been 4 international negotiating committee meetings so far. We call them INCs, and we are rapidly approaching our 5th and final session in Busan, Korea, which starts this November. And what can I say about what we have now after 4 INCs? I've heard it described as a very bloated choose your own adventure draft treaty text that we now get to wrangle over. And I think it's an understatement to say that so much remains to be resolved at INC 5. And I think a lot of us think it's a big task ahead, but we're remaining optimistic and we're pushing really, really hard to see our ideal outcomes in our final treaty. So I just can't wait to turn it over now to our expert panelists to tell us more about what's at stake here, how they think it's going, and what they'd like to see coming out of INC 5. And just a quick note, that picture in the bottom corner is several of us at INC 4 in Ottawa, Canada. So we really show up in force at these meetings. On that note, I'd love to introduce our first panelist, Shiv Shrivastava. Shiv is the policy director at Fenceline Watch, a community-based environmental justice organization based in Houston, Texas. He has a background in political strategy and opposition research, and he's also worked as a writer for television. As part of Fenceline Watch, he has contributed to efforts related to language justice under Title VI. He's fought against greenwashing and false solutions, and he's actively engaged in the UN negotiations for a global plastics treaty. So welcome, Shiv.
Thank you so much, Julie. I'd like to thank Plastic Pollution Coalition and you, Julie, and Frankie and Richard for being part of this panel. I'm so pleased to be part of it as well. So, as Julie said, I'm Shiv Shrivastava. I'm the policy director here at Fenceline Watch. We are an environmental justice community-based group here in Houston, Texas, along the US Gulf Coast. So why are we here? There's a good chance if you're on this call, you might have a passing knowledge about the threat that plastic poses to human health and the environment. Plastics have made it into our air, soil, and water. Microplastics and nanoplastics have been found in the placenta of expectant mothers, in rain clouds, and in our blood, a topic which Richard could speak to with much greater authority. Toxic plastic leaching occurs at every stage of the life cycle, from extraction of fossil fuels, production of plastic feedstocks and polymers, to waste. The explosion of plastics in the past 2 decades is unprecedented and untenable. Global generation of plastic waste has more than doubled since 2000, with vulnerable communities, small island developing states, and countries in the global south forced to shoulder these toxic impacts. The Norwegian Research Council estimates that by 2060, plastic production will triple. This is a conservative estimate, honestly. Many other analyses have us tripling production much sooner, closer to 2040. This threatens our planet and worsens a triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and loss of biodiversity. Despite the ubiquity of plastic, we have very little information about the chemicals that comprise much of the plastic produced. Approximately 16,000 chemicals are believed to be used in plastic, but less than 6% of those chemicals are actually subject to any global regulation. As Julie so perfectly summarized at the start just now, this process began in 2022 with the adoption of UNEA 514, mandating the creation of a legally binding instrument to address plastic pollution. There have been 4 rounds of negotiations thus far. This past August, the first and only scheduled intersessional work of open-ended expert work groups occurred in Bangkok, and they considered 2 key issues. The first, means of implementation and finance, and the second, criteria versus non-criteria approaches, chemicals of concern, and product design. This brings us to my community and other communities at the fence line of petrochemical production. Houston is home to the largest petrochemical complex in the US. We have 618 chemical facilities that span 52 miles of the Houston Ship Channel along the US Gulf Coast. The Gulf Coast has an additional 200 plus chemical facilities along Texas and Louisiana. It can never be taken for granted, and I always make it a point to point out, 99% of plastics are derived from fossil fuels, with 90% of petrochemicals produced going to make plastic precursors or feedstocks. So what are the impacts faced by fenceline communities by plastic petrochemical production? Communities such as mine live with the constant reality of chemical disasters. When I used to present on this, I used to say threat, but is something really a threat when it's almost guaranteed to happen? It's not if a leak will occur or an explosion or a fire, but really a matter of when. The images in the slide depicted from left to right are the 2019 Intercontinental Terminal container fire that burned for 4 days in 2019, covering the Houston skyline in thick black plumes of smoke containing butane-enriched naphtha, which is used to produce ethylene and propylene plastic precursors for polymers. The middle photo is a May 2023 Shell Deer Park chemicals explosion. That facility produces light and heavy olefins, including ethylene, propylene, and butylene for plastics. The explosion occurred as school was letting out. It's blocks away from a public school. As you can see, the bus crossing the flames. The explosion and resulting fire burned for several days, resulting in toxic emissions above the surrounding communities, as well as contaminated water actually being released into our waterways. The final photo was actually just from 3 weeks ago. TPC Group, formerly known as Texas Petrochemicals, experienced a multi-day flaring event that released toxic emissions well above permitted levels. The facility produces butadiene for production of resins and ABS styrenes. So what are the health impacts faced by communities at the fence line of plastic production? As you can see, Houston produces nearly 50% of the US's total butadiene production, ethylene production, and propylene production, as well as over a quarter of the nation's benzene production capacity. The health impacts are enormous and devastating. The chart on the right shows a breakdown of the risks faced by the community I'm speaking to from right now, where I'm seated at the moment, Magnolia Park. This community ranks in the 98th percentile in the nation for toxic releases to the air. It ranks in the 98th percentile for air toxic cancer risk. Of the little transparency our communities do have in terms of the chemicals used to produce plastic, we know many of them are cancer-causing chemicals. If you take a look at the pie chart from EPA's toxic release inventory system on the right, you can see a breakdown of chemical releases from just one facility and the massive quantities released in just 1 year. Now multiply this to include every petrochemical facility in our region. Low birth weights, infertility, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, chronic respiratory illnesses, and other life-altering diseases and health impacts are the norm for our community. Many of the chemicals used to produce plastic are not just carcinogenic, but also endocrine disrupting, meaning that long-term exposure can fundamentally alter your genetic makeup and lead to multi-generational toxic harm. What this means is that even if you move away from a fence line community, the fence line will remain in you, increasing the likelihood of your children or your children's children developing cancers or other serious illnesses. As I said, I'm in Texas. Our state has fallen to corporate capture, where our governor and many elected officials carry out the work of the fossil fuel industry, regardless of the health, safety, and environmental impacts upon the people. We turn to the federal level for help, but unfortunately, we've not seen the ambition and action necessary to combat the tremendous threat we are facing from plastic production. This is why we need a strong plastic treaty to provide global guardrails for our communities such as mine, and vulnerable communities around the world. We need a treaty that includes, first and foremost, production reductions. There's no way to address the plastic crisis until we turn off the tap. There's no such thing as a sustainable amount of plastic production. We need an elimination of chemicals hazardous to human health. We need a treaty that takes a hazard-based approach that is predicated on a precautionary principle in order to ensure protective standards for those most impacted by plastic at all stages of the life cycle. And we need transparency for the full life cycle of plastic. This means chemical transparency to know what's present in the products we consume on a daily basis. We advocate for a no data, no market approach. If there's no data available, it shouldn't be available on our store shelves, very simply. We need harmonization on reporting. Plastic is not isolated to one country or region. It requires harmonized approaches in reporting methods in order to assure a global standard for transparency. And we also need the treaty to include a just transition for those communities impacted by plastics to ensure that those who have been forced to carry the burden of plastics are protected and given equitable paths forward in a transition to a less toxic future. Briefly, I want to touch on the domestic side and some of the problems in the US's stance thus far. While all of us in the movement applaud the news that the US is shifting its long-held position of demand-side reductions towards supporting production reduction, there has not been an official announcement of this shift, what it entails, or how it squares with other policies the US is currently championing. Specifically, domestic US policy on plastics still heavily invests in providing incentives for false toxic solutions such as chemical recycling, hydrogen, and other industry-backed circular economy measures. This is illustrated starkly in the draft national strategy to prevent plastic pollution that does not address upstream production of plastic, calling only for further study of the issue. Finally, as we've seen through the INC process, the US strongly backs nationally determined domestic measures as opposed to strong protective prescriptive global regulations, essentially creating a scenario of a treaty that merely is a set of voluntary guidances that lacks enforcement mechanisms. And very quickly, I know my colleagues Frankie and Richard will touch on some of the barriers thus far in the INC process, but issues around conflict of interest have yet to be addressed, giving corporate interests undue sway. Next, a lack of access. Civil society observers have not been given equitable access to provide interventions at negotiations. Frontline, and indigenous voices even less so. The voices of rights holders must be heard. Finally, false equivalencies. We've heard Chair Baez champion the level of participation from civil society observers in IMC4 and point to that as a measure of an inclusive process. But as noted, the ability to truly be heard in these spaces and be included is something that has not been occurring during the negotiations, especially in intersessional work. This is a huge barrier in creating a treaty that truly protects the most impacted by plastic. Feel free to connect with us on any of our socials or email us at fencelinewatch@gmail.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shiv. You covered so many of the big top priorities for us and also some of the biggest challenges. And I think really made it concrete why something happening at the UN level, at the global level, matters on a day-to-day basis for communities in this country and around the world. So thanks so much. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Frankie Arona, who I believe is joining us from Climate Week in New York. Frankie is the executive director of the Society of Native Nations, an intertribal nonprofit dedicated to preserving Indigenous spirituality, culture, and way of life. As a member of the U.S. Environmental Justice Delegation and the Indigenous Peoples Major Group with the United Nations Environment Program, he actively works on the Global Plastics Treaty and other UN frameworks that address environmental issues. He is also a husband and a father, and his mission is to remind us that we are not separate from the environment, but rather we are an integral part of it, and that the health of both are inextricably linked. Welcome, Frankie.
Thank you, Haku. First and foremost, thank you to each and every one of you. Thank you, Shiv, for hitting all those points. I want to talk about our relationship to Mother Earth and all creation, and why policy in the UN Plastics Treaty matters. We stand in a critical moment where the Global Plastics Treaty promises to heal our planet from the plastic pollution crisis. But to truly address this crisis, we must weave Indigenous frontline and fence line perspectives into the very fabric of this treaty. With that said, it's been a very busy and crazy and insane 2 weeks here at UNGA and Climate Week, which I'm sure many here are also attending and can understand the craziness of these past few weeks, with still a few more days to go. So forgive me if I end up yawning during during my talk. You know, these slides will explain how we believe the global policy, such as the Global Plastics Treaty, has local impacts. And you'll see that this chart illustrates the potential and existing influence of corporate interest on global policy making that the results and local impacts. These show why it is crucial and critical for frontline and fence line communities to make our voices heard at the global level. Corporations collaborate with UN agencies to develop international standards and guidelines related to the environmental and social impacts of petrochemicals and fossil fuel projects that can help ensure the projects adhere to a minimum safety and sustainability standards. Corporations also lobby to influence UN policy decisions in their favor, leading to the prioritization of corporate interest over local concerns, human health, and environmental justice. International corporations invest in developing new and expansion projects for petrochemical and fossil fuel infrastructure, often in collaboration with local governments and with the support from UN development agencies. These investments make it difficult for local communities to resist and stop the continued pollution, adverse human health impacts, and degradation of lands locally. The expansion of these infrastructures can have significant environmental and social impacts on local communities, including air, land, and water pollution, displacement of communities, and disruption of traditional livelihoods. UN agencies play a role in mitigating these impacts through environmental assessments and social safeguards. The expansion of petrochemical fossil fuel industries leads to the reliance on fossil fuels and hinders the transition to true non-toxic cleaner energy solutions. These industries have severe environmental impacts, including air, land, and water pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, and the destruction of natural habitats. These have long-term consequences for the health and well-being of local communities. The development of petrochemical fossil fuel infrastructure also displaces communities, disrupts traditional livelihoods, and leads to social conflicts. And I want to say, for a millennia, Indigenous people have lived in harmony with nature, in balance. Our cultures are rooted in the understanding that we are not separate from the environment, but an integral part of it. We see the land, the waters, the air, and all living beings as our relatives deserving respect and care, not to only survive, but to thrive. The plastics pollution crisis is a direct assault on this connection to the balance of all creation. It desecrates our sacred sites, poisons our waters, harms our animal relatives, and threatens the very existence, our very existence. We see plastic waste choking our rivers, littering our coastlines, and accumulating in the bellies of the fish that we eat, including, like Shiv said, it's already in our in human bodies in every aspect. This is not just an environmental issue, it is a violation of our spiritual connection to Mother Earth, and it is a human rights violation crisis that has been perpetuated for generations by corporations and governments. The UN Plastics Treaty offers a glimmer of hope, but for it to be truly effective and meaningful, it must go beyond mere waste management. It must address the entire life cycle, death cycle of plastics, from extraction and production to disposal. It must also incorporate indigenous knowledge and practices that have sustained our communities for generations. And again, here's a few more reasons why policy matters. Policy needs to address the protections of sacred sites. Strong policies are needed to safeguard our sacred sites from the encroachment of plastic production and pollution. These sites are not just places of spiritual significance, they are also vital ecosystems that support biodiversity and provide for our communities. The recognition of indigenous knowledge. The treaty must recognize, respect indigenous knowledge systems that offer sustainable alternatives to plastic. For example, many indigenous communities have used natural materials like gourds and bamboo and plant fibers for centuries. These materials are biodegradable and do not harm the environment, but must be protected. That indigenous knowledge needs to be protected. Full and effective participation. We must have a seat at the table during every stage of the treaty process. Our voices must be heard, and free and prior informed consent must be obtained before any decisions that affect our lands, territories, and resources are made. And environmental justice, the treaty must address the disproportionate impact of plastic pollution on indigenous and environmental justice communities, which are often located near plastic production facilities and waste disposal sites, which expose us to harmful chemicals and toxins, reducing our lifespan at higher rates than any other demographic. And then I think Shiv even touched on it, the enforcement of accountability. The treaty must include strong enforcement mechanisms to hold corporations and governments accountable for their actions. Without accountability, the treaty will be nothing more than empty promises. My relatives, I'll end with this. We must stand together to demand an ambitious and meaningful plastics treaty that upholds our rights and protects our sacred sites and honors our relationship to Mother Earth. Let us weave our wisdom, our collective wisdom, into this treaty, demand it, create a future where plastic pollution is a distant memory. If we want to ensure a healthy, sustainable future for our children and our children's children, we need to make action and do action and enforce it as much as humanly possible at every level. And that's why it's so crucial and so important to be in these global spaces when we're talking about policy, that impact. And I'll end it with this. There was a time when I was sitting in one of the plenary rooms where somebody told me that this place had so much security, so much protection that you could leave your laptop, your backpack, all your belongings on the table in the plenary, go to lunch, go to dinner, and come back and know that it's going to be there, know that it's safe because of all the security. But this is also the same place that one word or one phrase can be at the detriment of a community, thousands of people in communities, millions, based on just some of the language and text that's used in these spaces that's being proposed in these declarations. So please, I encourage everyone, especially those that come from those disproportionately impacted communities, to be in these spaces and hold space and remind them through that uncomfortability of your presence and being there, you know, that what the humanness has been taken out of these processes, and it's the humanness that needs to be at these tables. We all need to be, we are those experts on those impacts and the solutions in our communities. Thank you. Haku.
Thank you so much, Frankie. I just want to say I appreciate so much when you're in these spaces, how much you do actually ground the movement and also remind the decision makers of what's at stake and tying it back to communities and natural systems that are at risk. And I feel like it's really missing from these spaces. The negotiators come in and are so buckled up and sit right down at a table. And I sort of wish Frankie could take them on a little nature walk first and ground them in what's at stake here. So I'm just so glad that you do show up in these spaces and you have such a huge influence when you're there. So thanks so much. And now I would love to introduce our final panelist, Professor Richard Thompson. Richard is a professor of marine biology and director of the University of Plymouth Marine Institute. He is a world expert on plastic pollution, and in 2004, he published the first paper describing the accumulation of microscopic fragments of plastic in the environment. He literally coined the term microplastics. His team has been at the forefront of research describing the distribution and impacts of plastic debris in the environment, and we're so happy to have him here today to talk with all of us. Thank you, Richard. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and also thank you to my fellow panelists. I feel there's not that much more I'm going to be able to add to it, but I'll try. So I've been participating in the Global Plastics Treaty discussions as a scientist. As you've said, I'm based in the UK. I'm a professor of marine biology, but I'm also part of the Scientists Coalition for an Effective Plastic Treaty, where we're trying to make sure that accurate, independent, unbiased evidence is brought as best we can to the decision makers in the process. Because as you've heard already, that's not an automatic right. It's not all that easy to get information into the treaty process. And we as scientists feel very strongly about making sure that nations are properly informed to make their decisions. It's really clear that there's an absolute necessity for this treaty. There's clear evidence of plastic pollution right along the supply chain. That's from material extraction through production, use to disposal. There's evidence of negative effects on the environment, on wildlife, on human health. And production set to triple between 2040 and 2060, literally threatening the pillars of sustainability for the environment, for society, and the economy. It's really critical that we act now because the problem is only worsening, and the challenge of reversing the damage will become almost impossible if we don't seek to act now. So in terms of the treaty, as I've said already, the scope of the treaty must address pollution along the full life cycle of plastics. Many of the discussions I hear focus on this as though it's just a waste management issue. It's absolutely not just about waste management. We're overproducing plastic far and away beyond the capacity to which we'll ever be able to increase waste management alone to satisfy. And that's directly acknowledged in the UNEA Resolution 514 by the signatories of UNEA 514. And so it's somewhat frustrating when I hear some member states try to take the discussion back towards plastic pollution is simply a waste management issue. That is not the case. It's absolutely critical, therefore, that we have upstream as well as downstream measures, and that must include polymers, products, and chemicals. We need measures that follow the waste hierarchy, and that means starting with reducing waste, i.e. a reduction in primary polymer production in the first place. There are many examples of plastic products that we don't necessarily need in the first place. We can't afford the luxury of products that we don't need. We can't afford the raw materials that go into producing them, let alone the waste that accumulates as a consequence of their unnecessary production. So how do we achieve this? I think it's important that we apply what I would describe as the essential use concept to make sure that the products that we produce are absolutely essential to society. We need to apply that to plastics, but we also need to apply it to alternatives and substitutes. This isn't simply about switching to a different material. We need to be sure that we're only making the products that we absolutely need. So having applied that, we then need to make sure for those products that are essential, that we apply safety and sustainability criteria, so that we eliminate the many thousands of chemicals that are known to be harmful out of the 16,000 chemicals that are used in plastic production that have already been touched on. So we need to establish which plastics and products are essential. And for those that are essential, we need to make sure they're both safe and sustainable. We need a material agnostic approach. And by that, I mean that any alternatives and substitutes that we seek, and I can see discussion of those in the chat, we need to make sure that they're evaluated in comparison to the traditional plastic materials that we seek to replace for each application. The key thing here is if we switch to an alternative or a substitute, we need to be absolutely sure that it's a better alternative or substitute, not just something different that's been designed to fill a market demand because people are tired of the problems associated with plastic. So the evidence is going to be absolutely crucial. Otherwise, we're going to find that we're moving towards false solutions. The key elements then for the treaty are that we need legally binding targets, for example, towards reduction in primary polymer production. We need global and national primary polymer reduction. We need to take a hazard rather than a risk-based approach. That is to say, we don't want any plastics to escape into the environment. It's not just about trying to seek out which plastics might be the most harmful. We don't have the time to waste with potentially hundreds of thousands of different risk assessments to consider every different permutation of plastics that are produced and their breakdown products. We need to consider that we don't want any of this escape to the environment, consider it potentially hazardous, and therefore eliminate those risks using safety and sustainability criteria as I've outlined. We're going to need bans to phase out chemicals of concern. And we're going to need transparency of labeling to make sure that the chemicals that are used in plastics are clearly identified. And of course, we're going to need enforcement for all of the above. In terms of the implementation of the treaty, in my view, it's absolutely essential that we have an independent science body, a body comprised of individuals who are free of conflicts of interests, and that must include independent scientists, experts, Indigenous rights holders, waste pickers, representatives of fence line communities, and other stakeholders. The key element being that these individuals must be independent of the member states that they come from and independent of financial interests, so that they can supply independent evidence to guide the process going forward without bias. Finally, I would say that financial mechanisms to ensure a just transition are going to be essential to make sure that the costs of implementing the treaty fall equitably among individuals, communities, and nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Richard. I just want to thank you for pointing out a few topics that I hadn't heard yet, which is how we want to avoid what we call regrettable substitutions coming out of this. And also, I just wanted to say the Scientist Coalition has been just so instrumental in fact-checking both what comes out of the low ambition countries and industry that shows up, as we know, in droves at these negotiations, and providing really the scientific basis for a robust and meaningful treaty. So it's been absolutely incredible to see how much influence you've had and how they really listen to you as a Scientist Coalition. So it's great that you've
Thank you.
Had such a presence.
It's good to hear. Thank you.
And one other item I just wanted to plug before we move on to the question and answer session or section of this webinar is that people are looking for solutions for sure, and we're working on that too. And reuse is one big area that I know we're all very interested in exploring and having incentivized by this Global Plastics Treaty, and that might come up as we head into the questions. So I just want to thank all of our panelists, Frankie, Shiv, and Richard, for joining us today. And right now we're going to move into the questions that you all submitted prior to the webinar. And I also just wanted to note that you can continue to ask questions in the Q&A. And I think we have about just shy of 20 minutes left. So hopefully we'll get to some of the most pressing questions. And just wanted to make a plug for Richard's most recent research has been just published. And I think Jen posted that in the chat there. So definitely take a look at that. So moving into the Q&A, we got so many questions. I think we got almost 100 questions prior. So we really tried to prioritize some that were repeat questions. And one that came up quite a bit for folks And I think we've touched on quite a bit of it, but I suppose, could each of you just say what your one priority component for this last negotiation is? What do we need to prioritize for resolution in Busan? And I'll just go in order and turn it to Shiv first, and then go Frankie and Richard.
That's a great question. For us at Fence Line Watch, and I think for a lot of the other panelists and a lot of folks at the fence line of these facilities, production reduction. Everything else is almost secondary. The toxicity and the chemicals and the transparency and the risks and all of those things, we are producing at a rate that is unsustainable. And we cannot address any of the issues that are tertiary to it until we turn off the tap. You know, you can't talk about, like, if your kitchen sink breaks, you don't worry about, oh, I'm going to need new flooring until you've shut off the water. We need to shut this off. So production reduction is a very simple answer, and the one that I truly believe must be addressed. We have to get clarification on where the US stands, and also find some sort of global understanding about this is a problem, and production lies at the heart of it.
Frankie, I know you agree with that, but anything else to add in terms of priorities for Busan for you?
Yeah, I think, I agree. Product reduction is at the top. We don't believe that there's any sustainable level of plastic production. And I think that it needs to be, really discussed and addressed when it comes to, the impacts on communities. But I think that, one of the other key topics for us is, upholding the rights of Indigenous people and free and prior informed consent. I think all of these, it impacts everyone's community if we're able to uphold those safeguards for human health and the environment. So I think really ensuring that those are included and uplifted and highlighted in the Global Plastics Treaty going into INC 5 is crucial from my perspective. Thank you.
How about you, Richard? I know you probably agree with both of those as well.
Production reduction is absolutely top of my list, and I was also delighted to see that was the top of the list from the audience poll as well. I mean, I was pleasantly surprised by that, because I don't think it's necessarily what you would hear ordinarily. So I guess I'm on the one hand pleased, but I'm wondering if you've got an audience here of the slightly converted. And it's, of course, the less converted that we really desperately need to reach to get that message out there. So production reduction. Having said that, when I start to think about where do I go next down my list of priorities, where I feel really most strongly is that we need to come through this with an agreement. So there's going to need to be some compromise made, and I don't want to lose out on the things that I hold most dear. At the same time, there's a real risk we could fail to reach an agreement, and so some degree of compromise, and well, it's a negotiation, and that's what we need going forward. But it's got to be backed by science.
That's actually a great transition to the next question that we had, which is what do we need to do to make sure that INC 5 in Busan is meaningful, and that what happens past INC 5 results in a strong plastics treaty? So what's sort of standing in the way? And I know a lot of people have been discussing this whole idea of the low ambition countries there are really trying to water down the treaty. Do we even need them to sign this thing, or do we stick to our, positions and try to get the best treaty possible? And if we lose some signatories, so be it. So I think that's a tension that I've heard come up quite a bit. But I wonder if maybe going the opposite way, or if Shiv and Frankie, you want to chime in on this too, but what do we need then? What do we need to do to make sure that happens, that we get a strong plastics treaty? Richard, I'll start with you, and Shiv and Frankie, if you want to chime in.
Okay, so I mean, you've got the low ambition and you've got the high ambition. In a way, I'm not so worried about either of them, because we're unlikely to change their vote, and the high ambition are where we want them anyway. So it's the floating voters, if you like. And what I worry, and I see to some extent, is misinformation that's trying to color the positions for some of those that are as yet undecided. I mean, the name of the country I won't mention, but it was a relatively less well-off country that I spoke to at one of the INCs, and the representative from the delegation said to me, we absolutely get what the science is saying, that we need measures to curb this, But we are worried that in our country, those measures, the information that we're getting, that we're being given, is that those measures could cost us too much and that we won't be able to afford them. And we're worried that whatever any obligations might be on the wealthier countries to help to finance that, they will renege on those obligations as they have done with climate. And so therefore, he was basically saying that for his nation, they were going to push towards something that was lower ambition because they were being given the frighteners, if you like, that they couldn't afford something higher in aspiration. And that's where I think the science is absolutely key, and working with those member states who are less decided, I would say. And some of them are small countries that, they lack a chief scientific officer. They've got a representative there, but that representative might not even be a scientist. And I think it's really tough for them. And that's something that frustrates me a little bit about the UN process, because I feel that, there's a right to science for everyone in this process. It's all very well, for argument's sake, the UK and the US bringing 6 scientists along to the negotiations. But what about those small island developing states? There's a right to science for everyone. And I think that's a right to science that the UN ought to be helping to facilitate a little bit more than perhaps we've seen.
Frankie or Shiv, do you want to add to that? What do you think we need to do or needs to happen for this to work?
I'll just kind of jump in. I'm really kind of taken by Richard's point a little bit about not so much, high ambition already being where they need to be at and low ambition being kind of recalcitrant to move anywhere. It's sometimes the devil is in the indifference. And so there's always that kind of reality. For me, when I think about what we need out of INC 5, and I kind of think about this question to get a strong plastics treaty, I kind of view this process as we're going to get a plastics treaty. Some member states are using the mandate 514 as, with an eye to completing this by 2024. So we have to hit that timeline regardless of whether it's strong or weak. I view this as, in order for us to get a strong plastics treaty, we need to really see the reality of the plastics problem. So when this process started, Frontline Watch has been part of the INC process, starting with INC 1. And through each INC, it's been a little heartening to see the problem of plastic not just be viewed as, okay, plastic gyres in the ocean or just in the marine environment, which is incredibly important, but an increasing understanding, an increasing discussion around the health impacts, the chemical impacts that are with it. And so in INC 5, in Busan, and moving forward, a greater understanding that this problem is a human health problem, and the cost of plastic has been artificially deflated. The cost of plastic has been deflated by externalizing all of the costs onto my community, onto Frankie's community, and so many under-resourced global South, small island developing nations. And I think, kind of again touching on Richard's point as well, for a lot of countries that don't have the economic resources to be able to say, yes, we understand the problem, we understand this is something that has to be dealt with, but this would be a huge economic impact, starting to get a better understanding, stronger, tangible understanding of how is this treaty actually going to be financed? What are going to be the concrete responsibilities, and how can we offload on those that are already disproportionately impacted by plastics? How are we going to provide the protections that a strong treaty could provide to show that it's something of value to advocate for?
Frankie, I see you off mute. Go for it.
Yeah, so I'm just going to add, I agree with some of what's been said, and I would just add that, I think some of our biggest challenges is getting over the fact that we've normalized, this industry and governments have normalized the harm on human life and in their environment. Again, disconnecting us from the environment as human beings, so they can be justified in how the environment is being treated and misused and abused. And my elder would say, if you really believe that you're separate from the environment, then let's see how long you can hold your breath for, right? Your very breath connects you to the environment. And so, I think we need to get over this practice of normalizing this abuse. And I would also say that when it comes to science, I've said this in many other spaces, even at the SPP discussion, is that, what makes science founded is trial and error and recorded history of it all, right? And so I say that's indigenous knowledge. Our communities can tell you what has worked and what hasn't worked. And I will say again, the experts on finding real solutions is going to be indigenous peoples. It's going to be frontline and fence line communities, those that have been disproportionately impacted by industry and by government for generations. And I personally don't, I think that, we need to go beyond INC 5. I don't think we're in a position to say that it's going to be finalized in Busan, because the discussion is, we'll come back to it. Well, we're never going to come back to it. We've experienced that many times. It needs to be addressed. We need to get it right the first time, because if not, that means millions of people. When I hear the words compromise, all I hear is more that all I hear is our communities being compromised when those words are being used. And that's upsetting to me, because, that's a tactic in itself, right? To force us into positions of having to compromise. And I can't go back to my community and tell my community that, I brought your chances of getting cancer from 70% to 40%. That's not a very big win in my community, and so we got to continue to push and for a meaningful treaty. And if that means that we need to extend it out to get it right the first time, then, I'm not saying, add a couple more years to it, because we need to deal with this issue now. Because while we talk about the treaty, while we offer, texting language and talk about preambles, our people in our communities are dying at exponential rates more than ever from these negative impacts. And so, yeah, I think it's a good question. And there's a multitude of ways of answering it, and there's definitely great conversations to have. But I think for me, I would end it with just stating that in order for it to be truly meaningful, the training needs to be led by indigenous and frontline fence line communities, because they're the experts of what the implementation is going to look like and really look like. So thank you.
So well said, Frankie. And I know we have a long way to go for the negotiations to reflect that, but I know we're all trying hard. And I feel like you read my mind, because the next question is sort of about that. But before I go to I think it's the next and final question, because we're almost at time. A lot of people in the Q&A and before asked, what's in the treaty? Are production cuts in the treaty? Are fence line and frontline communities in the treaty? Is just transition in the treaty? Is reuse in the treaty? And I just can answer them all really easily to say everything is in the treaty right now, and nothing is in the treaty right now. So cut plastic production, don't cut plastic production. It's all there for anyone and anybody in any position. It's in there right now. And now we have to go in there and try to remove what we call the brackets and get some real text negotiated. So that's the short answer to a lot of the questions. And please reach out to any of the panelists, and me included, if you want to have further discussions. But the final question, which I think really echoes what Frankie just ended on, and it seemed like a lot of participants were concerned about it, is kind of a multi-part question, which was, how will the treaty address human health and rights? Will the treaty reflect the necessity to include all stakeholders, particularly indigenous peoples, low wealth countries, fence line communities who are burdened with incessant exposure to hazardous substances throughout the life cycle of plastics production? And so again, nothing's yet in the treaty, but I wonder if you are hopeful that we're going to get those key elements, and if we don't, what is our plan? Or maybe we can save that for another webinar or discussion. So I don't know, Frankie or Shiv, you want to take that and welcome any of the panelists to chime in on this question.
Yeah, I'll jump in. It's a huge question, but the simplest, I guess, answer that I would have is how can we get this into the treaty is kind of what we've been doing, pissing off the right people. The inherent desire of a lot of member states and certain countries, I won't name all of them, but some that are familiar, aren't necessarily to prioritize what's going on in the communities that they're supposed to represent. And so, unfortunately, a lot of times it falls onto the incredibly difficult situations that communities such as mine are put into, being thrust into the face of leaders and decision makers who otherwise don't pay attention to the death and the despair and the destruction that's occurring by their decisions, and making sure that they know that these are living, breathing people, family members, mothers, daughters, sons, real communities that can live or die based on a pen stroke on a treaty signed in Nairobi or Geneva or anywhere else. So that's the way that we can get it into the treaty, because without the advocacy of folks on the front lines, at the fence line, indigenous folks, scientists that are not beholden to any kind of corporate interest, that advocacy is what's pushed us to the point we're at now. And there's still so far to go. And even after this process, making sure that there's strengthening mechanisms after it's adopted. But that's the only way I can see human health and stakeholder rights actually being addressed, by constant advocacy by those that are impacted by it.
I agree with everything Shiv said. And I would just say that I think that we need to keep pushing. We need to keep, trying. It's when we stop trying is when things get lost. So we got to keep pushing. And I would say that, everything should lead with safeguards for human health and environment. If we can lead with that, then I think that we're heading in the right direction, because as of right now, there is no such thing as just transition to a sustainable, renewable energy, because it's extractive to some communities somewhere. And again, we need to continue to keep leading with safeguards for human health and environment, prioritizing that. So that's what I would add. Keep pushing and never give up, and keep trying, never stop.
Richard, you're vigorously nodding. I know we're almost at time, but is your nod your ending remark, or do you have anything to add as we wrap up?
No, I mean, I support, I'm on a panel with like-minded, high ambition fellow members of our planet, and I'm really glad to be there. I just hope we can convince some more. And as you said, Frankie, yeah, keep pushing. Just to say, when I refer to a science panel, you heard the ingredients of that. It's an independent expert panel that includes indigenous knowledge, rights holders, fence line communities. We need that independent. The key is the independent knowledge that's not tied by financial gain. Otherwise, we're going to get it wrong.
Excellent. Well, onward to Busan, all of you. And this has been a great discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again, PPC, for hosting these amazing webinars. And I will turn it over to Rachel to wrap us up.
Thank you, Julie, for leading that invigorating discussion. Thank you again to our panelists and just our super knowledgeable panel. We just really thank you. I want to remind everyone to mark your calendars for our next webinar happening on Wednesday, October 23, Plastic-Free President, the Future of U.S. Policy on Plastics. You won't want to miss it. And if you haven't already, we invite you to join our global coalition. It is currently free to join as an individual, business, or nonprofit organization. And you can also connect with us on social media to learn more about our work. As a heads up, we will be sending out a follow-up survey after the webinar, and we really appreciate your feedback. It'll help us to improve our future events. We'll also send over the recording of this webinar in the coming days so that you can share it with anyone who was unable to join us today. Thanks again, everyone, for joining this conversation. Shout out also to our Plastic Pollution Coalition member groups and partners who shared this webinar with their communities and networks. We're so excited to see you at our next webinar on October 23. See you soon. Thank you.